or in literature are from English literature and culture. And I think this quote here from The Wind in the Willows captures the essence of badgers and American badgers in particular quite well. It says, "He seemed by all accounts to be such an important personage, and though rarely visible, to make his unseen influence felt by everybody about the place." So even though badgers are fairly secretive, they actually have an important role in the landscape due to some of the aspects of their biology that I'll discuss. And so to talk about the wonderful world of badgers, I wanted to first put them in the context of their family, the mustelid family. So these are the subfamilies of Mustelidae. I'm not sure if you guys can see my mouse when I move it around my screen, but I hope so. And what's interesting about the badger's lineage is where it fits into the larger family of the mustelids. So you can see that this cladogram here is showing when these different genuses broke off from a common mustelid ancestor, how far in the past. And we can see, with the ancestor being here, where my mouse is, if you can see it, but it's in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, that Taxidia taxus, which is the American badger, was the first genus to split off from the rest of the families that comprise Mustelidae. So it's an old genus and species, and it's the only one in its subfamily. And then we have some other badgers here at the bottom. So we've got the honey badger, next is Mellivera here, and it's the second oldest. It broke off soon after the Taxidia did. And then we have European badgers here in red, and a hog badger. And then here we have martens and wolverines and fishers. And then we kind of skip a clade here and have ferret badgers, which is another family I'll talk about in a little bit. So just to give you a closer look at the global distribution of badgers. First we have the American badger. This is Taxidia taxus. And a lot of these genuses and species have subspecies associated with them. Another species we have is the European badger, and they range across Europe, Western Europe primarily. The European badger is Meles meles, and then there's also an Asian version of this badger, an Asian species called Meles curus. And I didn't put a picture of it because it looks a lot like the European badger. It's just a little bit paler and have some different behaviors. They live in caves. Honey badger, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. Everybody loves the honey badger. These guys range across Africa and the Arabian Peninsula and into India. And then we have the hog badger. These guys live in India and central and southern China through Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, and Sumatra. And then stink badgers, which live on the islands in Southeast Asia, so Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and then in the northern Natuna Islands. And the ferret badger, which comprises a similar range to the hog badger and the stink badger. So focusing in on the American badger, there's 4 subspecies identified of the American badger. And for the most part, these subspecies are distinguished by morphological characters. So certain skull measurements, the length of their stripe on their back, were used to distinguish these 4 groups. So we have Jeffersonii here that goes across the generally the northwest part of the state, and Berlandieri. And both of these subspecies are within California, with Jeffersonii being the coastal badgers and in the northern Sierra, while Berlandieri would be the species you'd see in the Central Valley and in the southwestern deserts. And then moving east, we have Taxus and Jacksonii. So they range through North America and down into Mexico, which isn't included here, and up into Canada. They're most associated with grasslands and other open habitats and open stages of other habitat types, so also forest, meadows, or oak woodlands. They're associated with friable or diggable soils. And most of their biology is centered around their digging behavior. So as their name would suggest, and actually, just going back, the badger's name has a couple of thoughts on what its origin is, and one being the badges on the sides of its face. Another is that its name is from the French word bêcheur, which means to dig. And that's probably more likely, and how the other genuses of badger across the globe have all been named or considered to be badgers, because they dig and they look somewhat similar to the badgers in Europe. So their primary prey are burrowing mammals, and they also spend most of their time underground. So when they are resting during the day, and when they have young in a natal den. They're primarily carnivorous. This is a little bit different than a lot of the other badger species from Europe and Asia. Those are more omnivorous badgers. They eat insects as well, and sometimes fruits. American badger is almost exclusively carnivorous, and because it specializes on burrowing mammals, and its body is built for that. So they have really long claws on their front feet. Their front feet are a lot larger than their back feet, and their shoulder articulation allows them to dig through the soil almost like they're paddling, by moving dirt out to the sides. They also have a wedge-shaped head that helps them burrow into the ground, and they have a really strong sense of smell and hearing, since they're often hunting underground, and their sight is not so good. But they can hear and locate prey from above ground, and especially when there are hibernating small mammals, they can find them from above ground and dig down into their den. And although the burrowing mammals are their primary prey, that source is also supported by a variety of other prey types. So they will also eat birds and eggs, and will dig up wasp nests and eat Jerusalem crickets, and they'll also scavenge dead animals as well. So they're mainly solitary outside the breeding season. It's another quote from The Wind in the Willows that's apt for their solitary behavior. And although this quote refers to European badgers, American badgers are more solitary than other badger species. European badgers, to some extent, live colonially, although that behavior ranges from living in a large multi-generational group to just a couple or a few badgers. And although they're mostly solitary, I guess you could say the badger has friends. Recently, this video came out from Peninsula Open Space Trust, and it was filmed by my colleagues that I'm working with now on a project I'll describe later. But this video, if you haven't seen it, you should really have someone send you a link to it. But it shows some hunting behavior, well, not hunting behavior, but this badger and coyote kind of traveling together. And this behavior has been documented many times throughout history. The coyotes are well known to hunt with badgers. They'll follow them when the badger is foraging. And when the badger goes underground, small mammals will come out, say squirrels or prairie dogs will come out of their back entrances of their burrow networks, and the coyote can catch the above ground critters while the badger catches the ones that are stuck below ground. And this behavior was actually documented in a peer-reviewed journal article in which Steve Minta in the early 90s was able to observe badgers and coyotes hunting together and apart. And what he found was that when the two hunted together, their hunting success was better than when either one of them hunted alone. So both species actually benefit from this relationship. And it's not, it can at times be contentious. So not long before I was scheduled to give this talk, Jen sent me this photo that Kate McCurdy took at Sedgwick Reserve. And it's showing, I'm not really sure what this badger is doing. I think it is being aggressive towards this coyote who's investigating near its burrow. And so coyotes are known to prey on young badgers if the coyotes are hunting in groups. Once a badger is an adult, it has very few natural predators. So a few more aspects of its biology. The females weigh up to about 15 pounds, and the males can weigh up to 30 pounds. And those sizes are more common in the northern latitudes where they occur. Down here in California, they tend to be smaller. The adult females can be more around 8 pounds, and the males more around 15 pounds. So there's definitely a range in size. They're polygamous, so one male will mate with as many females as he can find during the breeding season, and the female will raise her kits alone. They have an interesting reproductive strategy called delayed implantation, in which the fertilized embryo doesn't implant on the uterine wall in the female badger until several months after mating. So they typically mate in the late summer and early fall, and the embryo will not implant until January or February. And it's a reproductive strategy to deal with cold winters. By timing the growth of the fetus this way, they're able to be born when the resources are at the highest level in the spring. So that holds true for for badgers in California as well, even though it's a more temperate climate. The females will have 1 to 4 kits per year, usually in late February, early March. And they'll care for them in the burrow for a month or two, and then start moving them around, carrying them around outside the burrow. And eventually they'll start hunting with their mom, and eventually kind of separate from her when they're about 4 months old. And young females can reproduce in their very first year in the late summer or fall after they're born. Males don't usually breed until their second year. And badgers are mostly nocturnal. They're occasionally active at dusk and dawn, and sometimes during the day, especially during the fall and the winter months. But for most of the year, they're primarily nocturnal. And despite their physique and their very short legs, badgers can really move when they need to, at least if there's nothing in their way. So in a number of studies across the West, so in Utah, Texas, Idaho, Wyoming, badgers' home ranges are range between about 2 square kilometers to say 10 square kilometers, whereas up in the northern parts of their range in Canada, they can have home ranges as large as over 500 square kilometers. So that's well over 200 square miles. They can disperse from where they were born to other locations up to 100 kilometers away. And sometimes they move at distances up to 20 kilometers in a night. They tend to use new dens nightly. Often they're digging new dens, and sometimes they're reusing older dens, either dug by other badgers or that they've dug themselves, but they move around a lot from night to night. They typically are in the den all day, and during wintertime, they might stay in a den for multiple days or reuse a den for up to a couple of weeks, depending on the climate where they live. So you'd see this kind of behavior, and it's basically torpor, not quite hibernation, because they do still forage during those times, but you'd see this kind of behavior in the colder climates up north. And so why would they be moving these large distances? Well, there's a couple of factors that influence their movement. So one of them being the season. So during the breeding season, males expand their home ranges quite a bit so that they can find females. And most other times of the year outside the breeding season, the prey is determined by, or the home range is determined by their prey. So where their badgers' primary prey is burrowing mammals and colonial burrowing mammals, those tend to have a more widely spaced and patchy distribution. So in those areas, you'd see them having larger home ranges to be able to exploit that prey. And that would be here in California, what you would see for badgers that mostly prey on California ground squirrels, or in the Midwest, in the prairies, on prairie dogs. So talking more about badgers here in California, some of the earliest accounts of badgers here came from Joseph Grinnell's work back in the 30s, when they published he and his colleagues published the fur-bearing mammals of California. Really some monumental survey work they did, and they included badgers in their assessment. And at the time that they wrote this book and did their surveys, Grinnell reported that badgers were fairly widely distributed throughout the state, except for in the far northwestern corner, and that they occurred at all elevations up to 13,000 feet, and to the low elevations even down to the floor of Death Valley. But generally speaking, through the mid-1800s and the 1990s to the 1890s, the centers of activity were in the valleys and the hills of the Coast Ranges, and also throughout the Great Valley, the Central Valley, and on the Great Basin Plateau, so up in Modoc County, also in Lassen County. And also they were found in the high mountain meadows and plateaus of the Sierra. So there are actually a number of badger collections from the areas around Yosemite and Sequoia National Park at from the high elevation mountain meadows. Now this map is showing some of Grinnell's occurrence data, supported by some other data that was collected between his data and up until 1965. And Grinnell first documented population decline from the mid 1800s to the 1930s. And he estimated that they declined by at least 50 to 90%. And across the following decades, they became even rarer across their range, looking from 1940 to about 1985. And during that time, they were listed as a fur bearer in 1957. So they were given a season for trapping. And they kind of tightened up some of those restrictions, giving them a certain trapping season and bag limit in 1981. And at that time, CDF, well, back then, California Department of Fish and Game, did another population assessment in 1985. And while these data show, they show more occurrences than the earlier data set did. Obviously, there's more people, so there's going to be more sightings. But even with that, there were areas that they noticed they had been trapped before and for which there weren't recent records. And those are these 3 areas circled here. So there was some evidence that perhaps some local extirpations were occurring across the state. And other than that, there was a general just lack of data about the population trajectory. And because of those reasons, the badger was listed as a species of special concern in 1986. And so as a species of special concern, its designation means that it's a species to keep an eye on and to consider in planning. So what happens to badgers that we might see population declines? Well, as I mentioned before, they're a game species. Up until recently, they were trapped, although in declining numbers. Since trapping was recently banned, that there was only a few badgers a year being taken by trapping anyway. But they can be taken at any time for depredation. So a lot of landowners consider them a nuisance species. And if you look at this picture here in the lower left, you can see kind of the damage that they cause when they're foraging. So these are hunting holes where they're pursuing prey, and sometimes they'll dig a hole and they won't quite get it, so they'll move somewhere else and dig again. And this can be, this kind of disturbance can cover pretty large areas in one hunting bout. So for a lot of, in agriculture and rangelands, this can be quite a problem. I've also been told in cemeteries, this can be a problem. So in that case, they can be trapped and relocated, or trapped and killed. And there's no limits and no permits needed to take a badger for depredation. They're really susceptible to being hit by cars. They just don't seem to avoid cars very well. They don't seem to try to avoid cars. They have really poor vision, and because they're most active at night, they're hard to see. And when they do find themselves in the road, they can't get over barriers like a K-rail or some other kind of road barrier, so they can get trapped that way because their legs are pretty short. So that's a very important cause of badger mortality, especially around more where the urban areas come up against the more rural areas. Another potential threat to badgers is poisoning from anticoagulant rodenticides. And this badger here in the lower right is a photo that I actually saw on iNaturalist and spoke or communicated with the observer of this badger. And she said it was a young badger that appeared to be dying, although she couldn't see any injury to it. And considering how anticoagulant rodenticides work, they're ingested by the mammals that they're used to control. So that's typically in a rural setting, that would be ground squirrels or gophers or voles. And they don't always die right away. They go into their burrow, and because of that delay between ingesting the poison and death, they do tend to die underground, which is good for a lot of predators that might be exposed to the poison, but for a species that digs to find prey, they still have a pretty high level or potential for exposure to those types of rodenticides. Some other threats that badgers face, or I guess challenges, are just some of the aspects of their basic biology. They have a pretty low reproductive rate. I don't know, I didn't mention before, but although females can breed in their first year, they don't tend to breed every year. And there is evidence that the older, that their reproductive success is linked to their age. So the older badgers are definitely tend to be more important for population persistence. The juveniles have high rates of mortality. In one study in British Columbia, they documented only 25% survival of juveniles that they had, that they were following with radiotelemetry. They're also pretty wide ranging, as I discussed earlier. They tend to move long distances. And all of these factors have been shown to be important indicators of a species' sensitivity to the effects of habitat fragmentation. So we see this in other large carnivores, especially mountain lions right now. We know a lot of work's been done on their population fragmentation across the state, and they're now a candidate for state listing. And we see this with other large carnivores as well. But even considering those other California carnivores, badgers are still especially sensitive. So this was a study done by Kevin Crooks in 2002, and he was looking at the occurrence of a range of carnivores in fragmented habitat in Southern California. And generally, he found that the size of the area that these species occupied scaled with their body size. So for larger carnivores, they needed larger blocks of habitat. Whereas for badgers, spotted skunks, and long-tailed weasels, they didn't fit that pattern at all. And they were only found in the largest habitat blocks, despite being much smaller than some of these other species. In that paper, Kevin Crooks suggested that it had to do with some of the specialized behaviors that these three species, all mustelids, incidentally, have. And for badgers, that would be burrowing, also long-tailed weasels, hunting, burrowing prey as well. Spotted skunks, not a lot is known about them in California. So that pattern kind of remains a mystery there. So all these factors led to the Department of Fish and Wildlife putting together a resource assessment project. And this resource assessment program in the early 2000s, and this program was a result of the State Wildlife Action Plan, which defined species and particular species that were facing threats that were not well known in terms of their population status, and focused grant money towards getting better data on these species. So in 2003, I worked under a series of grants from the Resource Assessment Program with the UC Davis Wildlife Health Center. And we were specifically looking at the population status of badgers in the state. And so to some degree, the Department of Fish and Wildlife had goals they wanted to see achieved with the research. One of them being to get an idea of the extent of the range of badgers, and also to look at their habitat use and find out if they're showing the same kind of large movements that you're seeing in other studies, especially up in the northern states, and if their movement behavior was putting them into hazardous areas. So if they were using roads a lot or agriculture, rangelands. So that was another goal of the study, was to better define their habitat use. And then ultimately, they were seeking to update the species status report for badgers to decide whether or not they deserved uplisting from a species of special concern to threatened or endangered. Well, there is several aspects to the project that I did under the resource assessment program. I'm going to focus on one part of it. I did a study at Fort Ord on badger movement and habitat use. Fort Ord, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's just kind of north of Hastings, and this is the city of Monterey over here, and Seaside and Marina, and then you'd have Salinas out here to the east. So I chose this site for a few reasons, one of them being that I knew there were badgers there, and also because it has very diverse habitat types. So it would give a good opportunity, provide a good opportunity to look at how badgers use these different habitat types. I was particularly interested in how they navigated in and out of this area, and if they navigated in and out. So especially given the fact that the area is surrounded by quite a few roads and irrigated agriculture on one side, residential and urban development. So it was a good matrix of different types of habitat that the badgers might be using. And here's just a look at the site. This is on Fort Ord. So we had kind of these extensive grasslands, and then also some slopes with this sage chaparral. There was also some oak woodlands and even some aquatic habitat. So to follow these guys, I trapped 10 badgers, and we trapped them using a snare, which was set in the burrow where we knew there was a badger. And once the badger gets caught in this snare, so it basically will walk out, and there's a little string across from the top to the bottom. So one leg goes through one side, their other leg goes through the other side, and along with their head, and that snare kind of closes right behind their front legs, and there's a stop so it doesn't squeeze them too tight, and then the snare is anchored to the ground, say 4 or 5 feet away. So once they're caught in the snare, they'll typically go back underground, and then we would fish them out with a catch pole and get the snare off of them. And then to track the badgers, they had to be implanted with radio transmitters because they don't have enough of a neck to wear a radio collar. And even harnesses from researchers that I talked to before the project, they said that the badgers would inexplicably somehow get out of their harnesses. So the most common way to track badgers is using implanted transmitters. And I have to say, to explain why they probably can get out of these harnesses and these collars, their skin is really, really loose. So if you pick up a badger, which I wouldn't really recommend, you can have 2 handfuls full of their skin and still not have a good hold on the badger. And this isn't intentional on the badger's part as a defense from predators. So if a predator tries to catch a badger, they can kind of roll around in their own skin to get away. So that makes marking them a challenge. I worked with some veterinarians, both at the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Monterey Bay Aquarium, who had been implanting transmitters in sea otters. So they were able to assist with these surgeries. And they were done either at a local vet in Monterey or at the Marine Mammal Center in Santa Cruz. And we eventually caught 6 females and 4 males. And after their surgery, we would hold the badger for a little while, and when they recovered, we re-released them at their point of capture. And typically the badgers were foraging the following night. So it seemed for the most part the implantation procedure went pretty well. So after we had them transmitted, we would track them with antenna, and we tried to get locations of active animals at least once a week. And this proved pretty challenging just because of the hilly terrain and because they were often underground and because the transmitter didn't have an external antenna. So we couldn't necessarily get a location of an animal every single day, but on top of that, we were usually tracking the active animals at night. They were really nocturnal and were usually active between maybe 10 or 11 at night to 5 or 6 in the morning. So we followed them at night to get their locations when they were active, and then during the daytime we located their dens where they would den during the day. And again, we would try to get each animal at least once a week. And then for each animal, we did a couple of sessions of continuous tracking where we just followed them every 15 minutes through the course of their activities during the night. So after up to about 2 years of tracking for the badgers that we had marked for the longest, we got an idea of their home ranges and where they spent most of their time. And so here you can see these polygons that define the home ranges of our animals here. And you can see how much bigger the male ranges are than the females. So this is a male here, this kind of magenta one. This green polygon is a male, this sort of bluish, tealish, this is also a male, and this purple one here. And then these other small polygons are all females. And the males' range was almost 5 times larger than the females on average. So we were looking at about a 5 mile square area on average for the males versus a 1 square mile area for the females on average. And the largest home range of this male was about 8 square miles. This very small, kind of dark blue one is a young female that had died that we weren't sure how, We also lost this female in the yellow here, and she actually died due to complications with her transmitter in the second year of being tracked, and we wrote a paper on that. But for the most part, in terms of using the landscape, these badgers stayed put, and they didn't really seem to go off the Fort Ord Preserve at all. And that might be due to the prey base that is at Fort Ord. So there's a long history of controlling ground squirrels there. It's a former military base. And so there was really only one ground squirrel colony that I knew of here. For the most part, they were feeding on gophers, with the exception of this guy with a really big home range. He also really liked wood rats. So he would also often be found in the chaparral and in the oak woodlands, where he would dig into wood rat dens. This other male whose range is here in purple, he actually did go across Highway 62 here over to the other side numerous times, and how he navigated that all those times, I really don't know. It's a fairly busy road, but over on the other side of the road, there's pretty abundant ground squirrel colonies. So he was exploiting those over there. And he was really the only one that kind of left this area. So I also looked at their habitat associations, and I looked at them two ways. So one was, where did they put their home range within the larger area? And so they typically sited their home ranges in areas of annual grassland. That was not too surprising, but also they had home ranges in oak woodland and the coastal sage scrub, and they preferred sandy and loamy soils. They tended to avoid the developed areas and the maritime chaparral, which was kind of manzanita dominated, lots of chamise. And then they did not put their home ranges anywhere near the agriculture and tended to avoid the clay soils. And then the second way that I looked at habitat associations was, how did individual badgers use the habitat within their home range? And these dots here are badger locations within a home range. And they didn't show a lot of, show any particular preference for vegetation or soil types, but they did tend to avoid the steeper slopes when they were active. And for their den sites, they preferred grasslands and sage scrub, and not the developed areas or the more riparian or marshy areas, which is, again, probably not a big surprise. They also avoided flat ground, which is probably because of just the mechanics of digging straight down into the ground is a lot more energy expensive than going into the side of a hillside. And then even at the finer scale, so how an animal moves in the habitat can sometimes indicate their preference for certain habitat types. So I mean, even if you think of yourself when you shop in a store, if you're in a store that you really want to be at, say you're at, I don't know, REI or Trader Joe's, you tend to move slower and kind of wander around in little areas. Whereas if you are going to, say, the pharmacy, you're kind of in and you're out. So you go straight to the counter, you pick up your prescription, and you head right back out the door. And so it's kind of the same or analogous with animals. Areas where their paths are more complex and their travel speeds are a little slower can be an indicator of a place that is a habitat type that's preferred, whereas they tend to move in more straight lines and faster through less optimal or less preferred habitat types. So I looked at these two movement types and how how they were affected by the vegetation type, where the animal was, the sex of the animal, and the season, looking at the mating season, the late fall season, and the spring. And what I found was that path complexity didn't really vary across any of these factors. Both of the sexes moved faster during the mating season and the spring, but only the males showed any kind of difference in their travel speeds between different vegetation types. And they showed these differences in the spring and late fall. So even though they did show different preferences, the individuals also had different preferences. So even though they used certain habitats more than others, different animals preferred different habitat types, kind of depending where their home range was. Across all the males, they weren't very selective of vegetation type in the mating season. So that's kind of an interesting result, because it gives you an idea of when at least male badgers might be using suboptimal habitat if they were to be leaving this preserve and going out into, say, across roads or into agricultural or developed areas. So looking at Fort Ord in the larger context here, I worked with Tanya Diamond, who I'll talk about some of our continuing work a little later. But when you look at this area where the badgers live, how can they, in the larger regional context, how can badgers that are leaving or coming into this area, how can they do it? And so this is a regional connectivity model that Tanya put together, and it's looking at the cost of movement through these different landscape types depending on what's there. So these green ones are the better habitat where the badgers can use, whereas these red areas have a lot of barriers.
Why don't you feed him?
So like developed areas and roads and whatnot. So you can get an idea from this image of how kind of isolated Fort Ord is here. There is some connectivity to the San Lucia Mountains to the south, but there's also that highway here that can be a significant barrier to movement. Well, from what we gathered in this study, we realized that you can, that for management, the planning for core habitat for a population of badgers should be on a pretty large scale. So at least 100 square kilometers to accommodate a group of badgers, like the one that I was studying, if that area is enough for a viable population. And we really don't know in the long term how sustainable the population at Fort Ord is, given the few number of animals that are there and the limited opportunities it seems to move in and out. Corridor habitat might be more flexible. So when they're moving between habitat patches, they might not necessarily need pristine grasslands or their most preferred habitat types. They move more in the spring and the summer, the late summer, particularly during the mating season. So that would be a time when you would want to make sure that any corridors between habitat blocks are accessible to badgers. So this might be most applicable amongst open space networks where there are roads or trails. And then if there's not optimal habitat, can you still connect these areas? How long can a corridor be? So, they moved about up to maybe 2 kilometers a night at the most. And so it would be a question of whether or not they can actually use the corridor or if they just move through it. And so There's still a lot of questions on how to best design that, but we also found that use of suboptimal habitat is most likely probably during the mating season, at least for the males. And that might be a time when they're at high risk for vehicle collisions on roads, or turning up in agricultural areas, or other areas where they might have to be controlled or removed. So this whole presentation used to end here. This research ended in about 2007, and I would talk about the next steps of looking at badger management on a larger scale. So this picture was sent to me from Stacy Martinelli at CDFW up in Napa County, and this badger has caught a gopher snake here. But since that initial work, a lot of other interesting studies have been happening. So Chris Lay in the Bay Area, he was at San Jose State, published his master's thesis on badger occurrence and habitat fragments in the Bay Area. Tanya Anahiga at Pathways for Wildlife, Tanya, who I worked with before, and her partner are doing a lot of habitat linkage work throughout the Bay Area with many species. And up in Canada, they've been continuing work with badgers. They consider them an endangered species up there. So they are doing a lot of genetic work that is actually challenging some of the delineations of the subspecies in that map that I showed you earlier, identifying different barriers in the landscape that are separating populations. And other landscape genetic studies were done in Wisconsin and Michigan, and studies on torpor in Canada. So a lot's been going on. The USGS in San Diego County is taking inventory of their badger populations down there, and they're looking towards doing another telemetry study and possibly a genetic study down there too. So that brings me to current work with the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District based in Palo Alto. And so back in the fall of 2018, the Mid-Pen Regional Open Space District released an RFP for evaluating badgers and burrowing owls on their properties. And this is on the San Francisco Peninsula here. They kind of cover this whole area, and then all these green, darker green spots are their open space preserves. And so coincidentally, around the probably, I don't know, 6 months before they had issued the RFP, I had been reviving my plans for badger research with Ben Sachs at UC Davis, and we were looking at doing a population genetics study in California, and we're seeking funding. So when the RFP came out, I reconnected with Tanya, whom I'd worked with before, and we put together a team to propose for the work. So our team was comprised of myself and Tanya, and we also brought in San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory, Yi Wang and Dan Wenny, to do the burrowing owl work. And we also got Ken Hickman, who's a local independent biologist who has done a ton of work on the peninsula with numerous species, and especially with camera trapping. He also joined our team, and we won a contract for a 3-year study on looking at doing a habitat assessment for badgers and burrowing owls. So we were interested in looking at owls and badgers together because burrowing owls have kind of declined in number across the peninsula and also in the wider Bay Area. But on the peninsula specifically, they no longer breed there. But the owls that do remain are wintering owls. And on the district preserves, like Fort Ord, the main small mammal that is there is are gophers. They don't have ground squirrels on the peninsula, at least from most of the west side of the peninsula down to the lower elevations on the east side. So the wintering burrowing owls tend to use badger burrows for their dens rather than ground squirrel burrows. So the district was interested in the association between those species. They also wanted to know if there were burrowing owls breeding on any of their preserves. And then, well, I'm not going to go into too much detail about burrowing owls as much as I enjoy them, but the San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory is leading that work, and I'll have their contact info later in the presentation in case you're interested in following up with that, on that. But so our project is basically, it's a habitat assessment, and we're looking at how, where these two species occur in the preserves based on habitat. And we put together two models. So one of them, the first model is based on the existing sighting data. And we used that sighting data in combination with different types of habitat data. So vegetation, slopes, roads, and terrain, and proximity to water sources. And we put all that information into a model along with the sightings data to see where badgers were most likely to occur based on those factors. And the second step in that model is to go and test its the predicted places where badgers will be, but through field data. We also put together and Tanya led this effort to model connectivity across the preserves, and looking at some of the same factors as the habitat model. And then to test the results of the connectivity model, will be using camera data in some of the linkages that are predicted by those data. And then the second part of the study is a population assessment, and this mostly focuses on the badgers. We're looking for to get an idea of the population size and structure, and we'd be doing that through camera data. We can identify individuals that are caught by remote camera photos, usually by the pattern of the stripe on their head, and also through genetic data. We'll also use the camera data to document where they're using the habitat linkages that were predicted by the connectivity model. So these two maps are showing the results of the initial habitat model for badgers, and then the areas that we're going to be following up to test the model by doing the field surveys. So these different colors are showing different levels of probability of presence for badgers and owls. They overlap to some degree. So the red is places where there's a very low probability of presence and based on the habitat, and then the yellow and the green is the highest probability of presence. And then all these little white lines here are these transects that are 1 kilometer long, and they're kind of scattered throughout different levels of probability of presence of these species, so we can verify whether they occur where they're predicted to occur, and whether they're not where they're predicted not to occur. So you can see that most of this area is actually red. It's a really interesting landscape. If I'm sure many of you have probably been there, but this box is zoomed in on the right-hand side. And so you can see these kind of ribbons of really good habitat that are, segmented by this red. And these red areas are these really steep, narrow drainages that are, filled with redwood trees and very thick understories of blackberry and ferns, and then these green areas are kind of open grasslands. This picture kind of illustrates that. So given the fact that badgers do occur on these properties, it's interesting to think like how they could move from this grassland here all the way over here through these really deep and steep ravines. So here's one of the results of the linkage model, and it's showing, based on the habitat, the best path between the larger habitat patches in preserves that are near each other. So this kind of yellow area is the optimal linkage for a badger to use to get between these areas. And then these black dots are actual sightings data. So to some extent, the sightings data was used to create this model. So what we would be testing here is whether or not they're using this kind of best case scenario linkage, because the other areas around it are either poor habitat, or there are roads or other barriers that would indicate that that corridor might be a hazardous one for a badger to use. And this is basically how we collect the data. So we just, we walk along these transects and we're looking around for, and again, I'm focusing on badgers, but we are looking for holes in the ground. And so something like this would be hunting holes from a badger. So where they're, you know, foraging over a large area, and you'd see these groups of holes with kind of the smaller tailing piles. Or we would be looking for something like this. This is probably a daytime den that the badger stayed the day in. They tend to have these much larger tailings piles and are kind of all by themselves. And then we're setting up cameras in the linkage areas that were predicted by the linkage model. And here's some of the early results that we have. We caught this badger on camera at the Russian Ridge Preserve, kind of in the middle of the preserve area. And we got this guy at Windy Hill. This is again one of the interior preserve areas. And then here's another camera image from the La Honda Preserve, and this one was captured in the winter time, actually in February, and you can see the badgers actually actively digging right now. So you can see in real time in this picture, you can see the dirt flying up into the air. And this is the same location at night, and the badger's ready to emerge for its nighttime activity. And it's kind of interesting because this badger stayed in this den actually for a couple of days. It went out, but it came back to this den, and then there was a couple days that it didn't leave. And as I described, that's usually a response to really cold weather. And this happened in a cold snap that we had in February, just a couple of days where it was really cold, temperatures in the 30s. And so this badger kind of did a little mini overwintering here in its den. So we were lucky to catch that behavior on film. For the genetic study, it covers a bit larger of an area than the peninsula itself. So we're looking at the badger population on the peninsula, but also in the surrounding areas, in these surrounding counties. So up near in Marin and Sonoma and Napa, and then of course the East Bay area, and down south to about as far as northern Monterey County. And there's some ways that we can look at the population in this entire region through how related they are to each other. We can look at you know, how relatedness a measure of relatedness changes between badgers as you move from one location to another. And we can also look at how related badgers are across the landscape. So with enough samples, we can get an idea of how gene flow is occurring throughout this area. So whether or not the badgers on this area are more related to badgers to each other than they are to badgers over here. And there's a couple of ways that we can think about gene flow happening here. So looking at this, the peninsula and this large block of forested redwood forest habitat, you can see that it would be, if you can trace the kind of open habitat that might be used as a linkage, you can see a potentially good corridor coming up the coast here from populations that we know to occur in the south. Fort Ord would be down, not too far down here. For badgers in the Diablo and the Gavilon range here, it's interesting to think about how they might or might not be connected to badgers on the peninsula. There's really very few opportunities to get from across this short distance, given the development here and Highway 101 running down right here, and then just kind of unsuitable habitat, except for this a very small, narrow area, kind of at the very lower or the very southern edge of Santa Cruz County. So we're really interested to see if this is one large interbreeding population or if it's to some extent subdivided by these potentially either natural or human-caused barriers. And so we use different types of samples to get DNA from badgers. A lot of those are roadkills. I didn't put pictures of that. I was assuming people didn't really want to see a bunch of pictures of that, but that's where we get a lot of our samples. We can get tissues from roadkill. We can get scat when we find it. It's rare. They often bury their scat. And we mostly focus on hair. So we use these hair snares, which we can install in the burrow entrances. And we can also pull hairs from the tailings. And here's some of those samples we've already run, and we're able to amplify the DNA out of those. And I'm going to wrap up right there. So we're still in progress. We've done 1 year of data collection on the Mid-Penn project, and we're still just trying to figure out the basics. So, you know, where are the badgers based on the sightings and based on the habitat that's present? How are they getting in and out of those areas? And what do the populations look like? Is it one big population? Are there several smaller subdivided populations? And then we're hoping to use this information for better management, both on the Mid-Peninsula District preserves and then throughout the Bay Area. And eventually, we'd love to have actionable data that can inform management statewide. So we're trying to creep out the boundaries of our study into adjacent areas. We do have some other agencies and folks that are interested in participating. And you can join us. We use volunteers to help with the surveys for badgers and burrowing owls. So you can contact Tanya or Yue. Tanya for the badger surveys and Yue for the burrowing owl surveys. And you can report dead badgers to me. That's where I can get DNA samples. And also if you have live badgers that you know of that are active in your area, either I or one of my project partners in the Bay Area can usually come and get a sample. And then our funders for this research, the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, has a website that documents some of our work and has some cool videos. So if you want to check that out. I think they also have the video of the coyote and the badger from the Peninsula Open Space Trust. which you do not want to miss. And just to acknowledge some of the funding sources for both this research and my grad student research. And I just want to acknowledge my project team, Tanya Nahiga at Pathways for Wildlife, Ken Hickman, who just has probably forgotten more than I'll ever know about the San Francisco Peninsula and its ecology, and then Dan and Yue at San Francisco Bay Bird Observatory. And Stu Weiss has been helping us out a lot. Of course, Luna, my husband, and my daughter have been very loyal surveyors and field assistants. And then Ben Sachs at UC Davis and Stevie are helping me learn how to do all the genetics lab work. And of course, a big thanks to the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District, and particularly our project manager, Kareen, who's been so supportive of our work.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I'll let you finish up. I didn't mean to cut
I'm
you.
done. These are all the field assistants that helped me with the research at Fort Ord.
Yeah, it was that was fantastic. Thank you.
Sure.
I think badgers are sort of the species that we are all sort of super interested in, but never see any sign of or evidence of, so we kind of forget they're around.
Yeah.
So we're so lucky to have you come and talk about the work that you've done. And it reminds people like me who have done a lot of work with behavioral ecology, how much effort goes into sort of putting together these models and predicting where animals are going to be and during what times of year they're going to be there, and then use that information to sort of protect those landscapes that are most important. So it's always nice to see all the work that goes into that for people like me who are really very, what's the right word? Surface level with the work that we do. But we have a lot of questions.
Okay.
A lot of logistics questions.
Oh,
so
okay.
How do you find badgers in the field?
Well, basically from the photo I showed you of a person walking across a grassland, that's how we find them. We pick an area and we walk until we see some sign that a badger was there. And we're lucky with badgers because they make such a big impact on the landscape and such a big mess with their digging that, you know, when they're there, they're easy to find. It just takes a lot of hoofing it up and down the hills. I've thought of using a drone or something. Maybe someday funding will allow something like that. But yeah, that's how I do it right now, the old-fashioned way.
And so how do you tell a badger den from a ground squirrel or something else?
Well, I'm sure glad you asked that. I just happen to have. So this shows kind of the key characteristics of a badger burrow or badger digging. Ground squirrel burrows are typically pretty small, maybe just a few 6 inches, less than a foot in diameter, whereas the badgers would be, you know, they're usually wider than they are tall, the same shape as a badger. The overnight dens will have a huge tailing in front. It can be 3 feet or much more. Hunting holes are kind of the same shape, but have very small tailings, and they'll be in a cluster like this. And this picture up here in the upper right-hand corner, this is a coyote den, and you can see how it's kind of tall and narrow. And there's claw marks going down the side. From the way you've seen a dog dig, they dig up and down, whereas a badger will dig, as I described it, paddles through into the soil. So their claw marks will be lateral across the sides of the den, and kind of spaced apart, you know, a couple centimeters apart. So they're pretty characteristic once you know what to look for.
And do you know what does it look like on the inside? Like, do you know how deep they go and that kind of stuff? And how does that architecture?
Yeah, they go pretty deep. They can go, you know, several meters down. Oh, wow. The one that we excavated, it did not go straight down or even just straight down, you know, in a slope. It was kind of spirally going down. And then they often will have a latrine area, a small latrine off to the side inside the den. So that's just for kind of a regular overnight den. They dig incredibly fast. So they can make a pretty extensive burrow in a short amount of time. A natal den where a mother's having her kits will be much more extensive. It'll have several entrances. Instead of having the kind of loose soil in the tailings in front of the holes, it'll be kind of packed down from going in and out the same places. And then once the kits are out, there'll be kind of both the bigger holes from the mom and then little digging holes from the kits who are just kind of exploring. So yeah, and I have not excavated a natal den, so I don't know what they look like inside, but I get the feeling that they're fairly complex.
And so if you think you found a badger hole, how do you know, aside from sticking your hand inside, that there's somebody inside, somebody home, or
well, there's a couple of clues you can look for. So if it's, because as I mentioned, they move so often, if there's a den that they're in, they probably just dug it the previous night. So the soil in front of the soil in the tailing would be kind of wet. If you dug down below the top layer, it would still be wet. There can be flies at the entrance. Badgers have a pretty strong smell, so sometimes you could smell their musk. It's a sort of spicy smell, I guess you'd call it. Yeah, sometimes you'll see their tracks in the tailing, but it's usually the fresh soil is the best indicator. Other times you will see a plug in the burrow that's from the inside, and so that's another way that there's a burrow with a badger in it.
Okay. And then we've got a couple of questions about the fires, particularly how badgers fare when there are fast-moving wildfires.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of people about this, not coincidentally. And I don't really know. I'd be curious to know. Their burrows are pretty deep, and depending on how fast the fire was moving, I would think it would be a good refuge, especially if they blocked out the entrance, which they sometimes do. If it wasn't a fast-moving fire, I don't think the outcome would be good for the badger. They'd probably get eventually smoked out. But other than that, I really don't know. I do know that after a fire that we had at Fort Ord, one of the badgers was really active in the post-fire area. And so I don't know if there was other burrowing mammals that, small mammals that survived underground there or something and were just suddenly very exposed. I don't know. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know. Do you know, I know you have some badger activity out at Hastings. Do you know if you had any in the burn area?
I haven't seen anything, although it's kind of a more inaccessible part of the reserve, and it's definitely worth walking around because it was grassland up until 2 years ago. But I can't say that the ground squirrels seem to be decidedly unbothered by fire. And it could be that because the fire burns so quickly through grassland that it's really just a matter of a few minutes of uncomfortable, smoky horrors, and then it's past. But I definitely, now that you're mentioning this, because I know we've definitely seen a lot more activity from mountain lions and coyotes and things like that we don't typically see a lot around. I mean, evidence of on the roads and stuff. And I think that there are a lot of exposed critters now that all the shit is burned out and that the grass is all gone. So it definitely could be badgers moving around. And so I will probably spend some time tomorrow. I've been tethered to my desk for a little while, so I'm that's an excellent excuse to get out and wander a little bit.
Great data.
Yeah. Well, I'll let you know if I find anything.
Please do.
We have another question about the capture technique. So when you snare a badger and pull it out, isn't it really vicious? And that's an excellent question because it seems like there could be a lot of places for things to go wrong.
Yes, and yes. So there's two scenarios, and also keep in mind that this is usually happening at night in the dark because we don't like to keep them in the snares very often. So when we have one set, we check it pretty frequently throughout the night. I was trained by this amazing trapper named Darren Simpson, and who's just an absolute pro at this. But anyway, in one scenario, the badger will dig back down into the hole, and that was the photos I showed you. And then you kind of have to dig it out. And so you've got about 4 feet of play on that snare from where it's connected to the ground to connected to the badger. And so you have to dig all the way down until you get close enough and they get defensive, and then they'll come out at you. And so they have that radius of 4 feet to run around where they're connected to the ground, and you just have to kind of catch it with the catch pole. I don't know how else to describe it, but you just have to sort of corral it. It's definitely a 2-person job. And one person gets it. Again, you have to get it behind the legs on the catch pole. It's like the pole like a dog catcher uses, because otherwise they'll slip out. And then you take them with the catch pole. We put them in a canvas bag, and once they're in the bag, we can cut the snare off where they're attached to the ground. And then from the bag, we put them into like a 50-gallon wine barrel. Like one of those plastic ones, and that's how we hold them until they have to go to get their transmitter implanted, which is usually again overnight until the next day. So that would be either in our trailer or in the back of my truck, and hope they didn't get out.
So what's the release protocol? You just turn them loose and they go?
Yeah, so after they have the surgery, and to be honest, once they're in the dark and once they're in the barrel with with a blanket, they kind of calm down. And after their surgery, we keep them to make sure that they're completely recovered from the anesthesia. And once they're kind of active again, and at this point they'd be in an animal carrier, not in the barrel. So we can carry them out to the place where we caught them and just kind of open the door and back off. So yeah, and we usually do that at in the daytime, so that they'll have some time to rest underground before they start foraging again at night.
All right, let's do just one more. If you wanted to see a badger, where are the best places to do that? And if you are so lucky to see a badger, how best can you behave to not get attacked by said badger or scare the badger?
So despite their reputation, badgers are, as we say with most wildlife, they're more scared of you than you are of them. But so before they run and attack you, they will try to get into a burrow. So you don't have to worry too much about that. Although if you do get close to the burrow that they've gone into, they will come back out at you just to make sure you go away. They don't run that fast, but fast enough you don't want to be too close. So I would say the best place to actually see a badger, it's a tough thing. I would say probably Point Reyes, all those grasslands down by the point, by the lighthouse. They have a lot of badgers down there, and that's where I've seen them out, like in the day. But even I've hardly ever seen badgers except for the ones that I've caught. So I'm not even the best source on that, but definitely Point Reyes is one hot spot. And out of the state, I mean, they're pretty common at Yellowstone. So if you find yourself up there, there's some places that you can reliably see badgers, and they're out in the daytime more often there. Yeah, that's all I can. Those are the only places I can really think of. I've heard that there's a lot up at Lassen National Park too. But that's kind of sage habitat, so I don't know how readily you'd be able to see them. Definitely want to find the open grasslands, preferably grazed. That's your best chance.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
I see I'm way over time, so I appreciate everyone sticking with me.
no, that's it's no problem. I mean, we've been trying to do this for a long time. I mean,
Yeah,
we
yes.
tried to do an in-person talk in March, I guess.
I think it was, yeah, it was right before everything shut down, I think.
Yep. And
Yeah.
so we very nearly made it happen, but I appreciate you rising to the occasion this time. I know it's tough to talk without being able to have any interaction with the audience. It's
very different.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. And if keep an eye on your emails, we will hopefully be doing more of these things once we get sort of out of our fire danger area. So yeah, thanks everyone.
All right. Thanks everybody.